It was the year of 1848 in the United States. The Mexican-American War was nearing its end, and places like California and New Mexico would be ceded to the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In the late January of 1848, James W. Marshall was examining the channel below Sutter's Mill, California, when suddenly he discovered some shiny flecks in the channel bed, later to be identified as gold. What he didn't know was that this discovery was going to send immigrants to the United States who would mine and explore the land for wealth. But this discovery was also going to begin a clash of cultures and a spread of ideas, changing the West forever. In 1845, James W. Marshall began working for John Sutter as a carpenter in the Sacramento Valley. He improved his economic prospects, bought a ranch, and began raising cattle. However, after returning to his land, after joining John C. Fremont's California Battalion in the Mexican-American War, he found out that his cattle had been stolen, forcing him to sell his land. This was when he formed a partnership with John Sutter to build a sawmill. It was at that sawmill where he discovered gold on January 24, 1848. Marshall immediately notified Sutter, and Sutter made his workers swear to secrecy. However, it wasn't long until this big news started spreading nonetheless.
The people that went on the gold rush were not obviously the first people that were in California. California early on belonged to Mexico, but by 1849 there were quite a few settlers along the Yuba River and the Sacramento River in California. And the gold rush was on, and the word spread back to the eastern seaboard, and people came out here by the thousands to California.
As information spread around the world about this discovery of gold, people came from far and wide to explore the California land and to get their hands on some gold. As people arrived to California, they began to explore the land to see what they could find. However, many of the miners were not as successful as they had hoped.
Many of the early miners were not miners. They came west on the wagon trains.
Many of the miners that came to explore the land came to get rich or to support their families, so most of the miners hadn't had very much prior experience in mining. And this was one of the reasons, along with how hard it was to find gold, that many of the miners were unsuccessful during the gold rush. The failure to find gold sent the miners into a depression, and many of the immigrants wanted to go back home, fearing that they had made a big mistake. This depression turned into a rampage, and many of the miners would do anything to get their hands on some gold. This gold fever that the miners encountered turned some miners into thieves, and even some into murderers. The miners came up with many ways to cope with the loneliness and depression encountered during the gold rush. The immigrants, either from other countries or from other states, would send letters to their families about how life was like in California. In the mining camps, the miners would gamble, play games, and dance. They would also mingle with the other miners and socialize to lessen their loneliness. In 1849, John Nichols wrote a song to the tune of "Oh Susanna" called "Oh California," about his journey to California for the gold rush.
I come from Salem City with a washbowl on my knee, one to California, the gold dust for to see. It rained all night the day I left, the weather it was dry. The sun so hot I froze to death, so brother don't you cry. Oh California, that's the land for me. I'm bound for San Francisco with a washbowl on my knee.
To add on to the casualties from the gold fever that the miners encountered, there were also many deaths that came from the environmental dangers encountered in the mines. These environmental accidents contributed to some of the long-term effects from the gold rush that can still be seen today. During the gold rush, one form of mining that greatly contributed to these environmental accidents and casualties was called hydraulic mining. This type of mining was where a 16-foot nozzle shot water at mountains and hills, stripping away the land to search for gold.
But the hydraulic placer miners washed down high bluffs, and those bluffs were wet, soaked with water. They had a tendency to collapse, and miners got buried and under tons of dirt, and they didn't have any equipment like they do now to dig them out, so that was the grade.
Some of the damage from this destructive mining can even be seen today in the Sierras. This form of mining also contributed to some of the deaths of the miners. Another danger that was encountered during the gold rush was the poisoning from the mercury that was used during mining. The reason this was a danger was because the mercury would accidentally travel out of the mines, into the lakes and rivers, into the fish, and then would become somebody's lunch. However, one of the most important encounters during the gold rush was the clash of cultures and the spread of ideas forming the West and the melting pot that the United States is today. Immigrants gathered from all around the world and exchanged ideas with each other that spread across the United States.
They were all nationalities that you can think of. They were European, Swedes, Norwegians, I'm a Norwegian, English, Dutch, a few Spanish, but not that many, French, Germans, all over Europe. People came to the United States, and then with the gold rush, they came out here. And they were from states all the way from New England to Tennessee and South Carolina that came here.
Although there were so many people that migrated to California for the gold rush, nearly everyone benefited except for the miners themselves. Blacksmiths, bakers, transport services, anybody who sold things to the miners benefited during the gold rush. While the miners that found gold greatly benefited, gold was so scarce that a small amount of miners that came to the gold rush actually found gold. Along with that, there was also so much racism and discrimination against the immigrants during the gold rush. Native American tribes were chased off of their lands, and the Chinese were treated very poorly as well. During the gold rush, the Chinese immigrants formed Chinatowns for the immigrants to live and to preserve their culture while they were away from China. However, the racism and discrimination that was against the Chinese led up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers. These were some of the things that resulted from the gold rush. However, there were also some very important things that developed and changed the West for years to come. California was known during the gold rush for having fertile soil and a flat terrain, with rainy winters and dry summers. This was important to the miners during this time, and was also important after the gold rush, when agriculture techniques greatly advanced, including the use of large headers, combine harvesters, and gang plows. As the mining was ending, farming took center stage. This was one of the things that resulted from the ripple of effects and the movement that was created throughout the United States. The California Gold Rush, while being a violent time in American history, left an impact on society, and even today, some things would have been different if the gold rush had not happened. The rapid growth of population during the gold rush in 1850 resulted in California becoming a state, and became widely known as the Golden State. About a decade after that, gold was discovered in the Boise Basin in Idaho, and many miners from the California Gold Rush and beyond traveled to Idaho, eventually causing Idaho to become a state as well. These gold rushes have helped form the West as we know it. California Gold Rush attracted so many people from around the world, and without these gold rushes, the Asian populations in the United States after 1850 could potentially be smaller than it was with the gold rush, or could at least form years later through other historical events. In present day, thanks to these gold rushes, we now have large and thriving cities in San Francisco, California, and even in Boise, Idaho. The California Gold Rush has spawned books, movies, and even television shows throughout the media that can help us learn more about the gold rush. Also, the San Francisco 49ers were named after the miners that came to San Francisco during the California Gold Rush. Thanks to the exchange and spread of ideas that happened during the California Gold Rush, the West was formed, and cultural diversity can be celebrated in the melting pot of cultures that the United States is today. All these things were a result of the significant California Gold Rush.
I'm bound for San Francisco with a washbowl on my knee. Oh, California, that's the land for me. I'm bound for San Francisco with a washbowl on my knee.